Hi, I'm Kyle Bass, Associate Artistic Director at Syracuse Stage and your curator for Wednesday at 1. And I want to welcome you to the final Wednesday at 1 of our season. And it has been an unusual 2021 season with all virtual programming here at Syracuse Stage. So thank you for your support. I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Greg Homann. Greg Homann is a multi-award winning South African-born theater director, playwright, dramaturg, and academic living in the UK. For over 15 years, he worked in South Africa, where he was associated with some of the most successful, hard-hitting, and critically acclaimed work staged in that country in its recent past. Greg is the editor of a collection of post-apartheid plays called At This Stage, and co-editor of 2 books on South African theater, drama, and performance, one being the Methuen Drama Guide to Contemporary South African Theater, which includes a chapter by Dennis Walder on Ethel Fugard, the playwright, of course, of Master Harold and the Boys. Greg has headed up 2 of the foremost higher education theater and performance departments in Johannesburg. He has designed and taught directing, playwriting, and acting courses, and has lectured on post-colonialism, theater history, and identity studies. For 3 years, he was the resident dramaturg of the South African State Theater and was part of the artistic committee of South Africa's renowned National Arts Festival. He has been lauded for his dramaturgy and directing of productions of new work, including directing 10 premieres, 6 of them new South African plays. His playful and cheeky takes on world classics also have been a key feature of his work, his body of work. In 2014, Greg was the recipient of South Africa's highest award for theater, the prestigious Standard Bank Young Artist of the Year. It is my great pleasure to introduce Greg Homann, and thank you for joining us for his talk.
Hi, my name is Greg Homann, and I'm the dramaturg on this production of Master Harold and the Boys. Thank you for joining us for this short talk, where I hope I can offer you a few insights into Ethel Fugard's life, his process as a writer, and obviously a little bit about the play. Master Harold and the Boys was first staged in 1982 and has had a long and very celebrated life as a work. It now stands as a seminal text of contemporary world drama. So what we are going to touch on in this talk is really just the beginnings of how the play works dramaturgically and a few thoughts that lead us to an understanding of Ethel Fugard's process. In order to do that, I thought it might be useful to start with some of Fugard's own words about his work. In 1999, he wrote a short introduction to the collection of plays, which has popularly become known as the Port Elizabeth plays, Master Harold and the Boys being one of them. And in that introduction, he said the following: "At the best of times, labeling is a very frustrating experience for a writer. But there is one label that I live very happily with and have no hesitation in using when talking about my work. I am a regional writer, and like all the other labels, the most irksome being political playwright, it has the virtue of being completely accurate. Virtually all my plays are rooted in the specifics of one place and time, that little corner of South Africa centered round Port Elizabeth. That is where I grew up, where I have spent the major part of my life, and where my imagination has flourished. I have mastered the code of that time and place. I can read the flow of life on that pavement. That street corner is home in the profoundest sense of the word. I belong there, and because of that, because it is mine in a way that no other place in the world can ever be, I have a sense of authority when I write about it." So I'm interested in talking a bit about Fugard as a regional writer, about what is often called his regional texture. What are the mechanics that help him capture an authentic sense of the time and place he is writing from? In Master Harold and the Boys, it's 1950 Port Elizabeth. Why was Fugard's work, which is rooted so specifically in what he has called one little corner of South Africa, why has it become so universal? Why has his work become so universal? And what are the dramaturgical nuances of his mastering of this code of time and place? And how is that evidenced in Master Harold and the Boys? So there is a collection of questions that I'd like to try and grapple with. And in order to do that, I thought that we might begin by looking at a map so that we can get a clear sense of this little corner of South Africa that Ethel Fugard is talking about. So here is a map of South Africa, and you can see this area indicated here in the circle is where Port Elizabeth is located. Obviously, it's much smaller than the circle that I've drawn, and it is no longer called Port Elizabeth. As of 23rd February of this year, Port Elizabeth was renamed Kleberga, and it now has got a new name in relation to it as a place. If we hone in a little bit more closely on the area that we're talking about, so there you can see its new name. And here is St. George's Park Cricket Ground, where St. George's Tea Room is or was in 1950, and where the play is set. And I'd like to also draw your attention to this area up here, which is New Brighton. And it's worth looking at how these highways and byways kind of cut this place, which used to be called Port Elizabeth, into sections. Because what these highways and byways do is they are a mechanism for apartheid planning and city planning to segregate. So this area during apartheid was zoned by the Group Areas Act as a white area. This area during apartheid was zoned as a colored area, and this area up here called New Brighton was zoned as a native or black area. And you can see that even though Google Maps shows us this today, there is some sense of the legacy of apartheid that still geographically sits within the place, even though freedom of movement and the legislation is no longer binding. If we look in a little bit more detail to get a sense of scale, we can see that here is St. George's Park. I've indicated it as the swimming bath, which I'll talk to in a moment. But this is the setting of the play is in that area there. And this is where Sam and Willie come from and live, New Brighton. And you can see that today the journey from the one space to the other by car is approximately 15 to 20 minutes. And that is obviously by car. With Sam and Willie would be taking a bus. They might be taking most probably 2 or even 3 buses to get to New Brighton. But it nonetheless gives you a sense of scale that what we're talking about is a very small area that is quite complex in its politics and in its nuances. If we look in a little bit more detail to what would be Halley's world, here is St. George's swimming bath. And that, as I said, the reason I'm locating the swimming bath is because the tea room was located adjacent to the swimming bath. So within this park, this whole area here, which includes the park and the famous cricket ground, as well as a museum and a few other amenities and recreational activities, the tea room is within or adjacent to the bath. Here is the school that Halley and Ethel Fugard, they're one and the same person in some respect, went to. And the school still exists. It's still there. And Google Maps tells us that today, if we walked from what would have been Halley's school in 1950 to the tea room, it's a 15-minute walk if we take a route that most probably is the long way round. So Halley's walk from school on the day that we encounter him in the play is about a 10 to 15-minute walk in the rain. Port Elizabeth, I should mention, is also known as the Windy City and is known for sort of rain throughout the year as well as quite heavy winds. Here is a relationship between the tea room and the hospital where Halley's dad would be at the start of the play. And that gives you a sense that that's a 10-minute drive by car. So, which is mentioned in the play. Halley says exactly that. He plots what he thinks would be the timeline from his mother leaving the tea room to the hospital and returning home, which gives you really a sense of the texture of how small Halley's world is. And this map really shows that. So we've got the tea room here, the school that he went to there, Donkin Street is here, which is the park that he talks about. Park's probably situated around there. And this is Main Street, which is where the bar is that Halley's father has gotten drunk before and has had to be carried home, which is all part of some of the details of the play. So we can see that a walk from the one side of what I would call Halley's world to the other side of Halley's world is a 28-minute walk. And if we look at the broader context of the map, so this is the area that we've been talking about. Halley's world is largely situated here. I'm not exactly sure where his home would be, although we do know that Ethel Fugard's postal address is in that area there, Walmer. And there is New Brighton. And if we detach it from the play for a moment and talk more broadly just about Fugard, we know that Sizwe is dead, which he workshops with John Carney and Winston and Shauna, is set in New Brighton. We know that there is a play set somewhere over here in Valley Road, which is Hello and Goodbye. We know that this play, Master Harold and the Boys, is set over there. We know that the relationship to Corston, and if we had a map that went a little bit further up to the area above, we can get a sense of pretty much all of the plays, or a number of plays, not all of them, but a number of the plays are set within this very small corner of South Africa. Okay. So with those places then located in our imagination, let's talk a little bit about Fugard's use of what he likes to call his images. And we know quite a lot about this aspect of his process as a writer from his notebooks, because in his notebooks, which have been widely published, he talks about the images that have sparked ideas for him. He moves backwards and forwards over time in thinking about these images, sometimes developing the idea for a play over a number of years. And many of these images come from Port Elizabeth, from his life, from his memories as a child, and from his images that he sees in daily life. And it's this process that he followed in identifying an image and trying to locate words to that image and trying to understand the meaning of that image. That is what many of the plays center around. So to give you some examples from his other texts, in Sizwe Banzi is Dead, which, as I mentioned, is a play that he workshopped with Winston and Shauna and John Carney. It's a collaborative piece of writing in that sense. The central image of Sizwe Banzi is Dead is the image of a smiling black man in the heat of apartheid, 1972 in that play, with a pipe in one hand and a cigarette in the other, cross-legged, smiling and having his photo taken. And that famous image from Sizwe Banzi is Dead captures a sense of someone caught between two ideas of their sense of self, which is exactly what the play is about. It's an exploration of what it means to be dehumanized through the process of apartheid in the early 70s. It's that central image around which Fugard, alongside John Carney and Winston and Shauna, explore the themes of identity in the face of oppression. And the image locates the themes and what the work is about, and the words locate the image. And this combination of image and word is working in tandem to create the overall impact of the piece. Another example, in Bosman and Lena, there is a similar effect in terms of how Fugard arrived at the process of writing the play. In his notebooks in 1968, he identified a character that he started to call Lena. She is someone he has observed, and he has different Lenas that he's observed in and around Port Elizabeth. So in Glendore Road, he has observed a Lena who worked for him briefly and who has had to make her home in a bush along the Glendore Road. He describes her burden In these notebooks, he describes her as being without the slightest flicker of self. Another Lena is on the Swartkops rivier or river. Here he describes her, and I'll read from the notebook. He describes her as scarf on her head, faded maroon blouse, and an old blue skirt, barefoot, unseeing eyes, focused, if anything on the ground. Focused, if anything, on the ground just ahead. We were merely white men. Nothing could have been more remote from her life, from her experience of herself at that moment. Walked like a somnambulist, face shriveled and distorted by dissipation, resentment, regrets. And he goes on to add the physical texture of the place that he's observing her. He's observing her alongside a friend of his who he's fishing with. And he describes the physical texture of the place that he sees, that aspect of Lena, as being mud. And that word mud kind of starts to anchor how he positions the characters in the world of the play. So the image of Lena is centered around someone who's physically grounded in mud, an image of her struggle to survive and to live beyond her circumstances and the oppression that she is experiencing. In a latter part of his notebooks, the image is about a confrontation of Lena with another man who he calls Bossman, and we start to then get Bossman and Lena, two people who carry the burden of their existence on their entire backs, or their entire existence on their backs, both metaphorically and literally. So let's talk then about Master Harold and the Boys. And there are a series of images at play in that text. And in true Fugard style, the series of images are revisited in different ways within the play. And through the course of the play, these images are loaded with meaning. And in being loaded with meaning, the character's relationship to the image changes, as does ours. So one example of this, without giving away too much, because as I know, some of you might not have yet watched the production, but one of these images is the image of the kite, an image for Hallie of his boyhood days where he visits the boarding house room where Willie and Sam live. He observes Sam making a kite out of bits and pieces of string, brown paper, flour and water for glue, tomato box wood, and two of Hallie's mom's old stockings. And it's a cobbled together bit of happiness that Sam is trying to create for Hallie. And the image is the starting point for Fugard to build a kind of empathetic relationship to the image. That through the course of the play, we are going to learn more information about. So that moment of making the kite, of flying the kite, and of the meaning of the kite, which is Hallie trying to understand in his questioning with Sam, which Hallie is trying to understand in his questioning with Sam, is all part of loading the image and building the image up in a way that gives it life and growth and change. So once again, the pattern is of Fugard taking an image and developing its meaning through the course of action, layering it, contradicting the image, often turning it on its head and giving it an arc within itself, the image becoming a character within the piece. There are other examples in Master Harold and the Boys. The kite relationship to the bench becomes a crucial moment. The boarding house and the way in which Fugard writes how Hallie relives the journey that he takes as a young boy, 6 years earlier, to Sam and Willie's room. Dramaturgically, Fugard is doing a really interesting thing in this section of the text. In Hallie retelling the story, he begins the story in past tense and quite quickly moves it into present tense. So by doing this, the present tense nature of the telling makes it more immediate for us and in how we imagine it. He then moves it into past tense again once he's developed our relationship to that memory that Hallie is telling. The other key image of the play is Willie and Sam's relationship to ballroom dancing. Fugard uses Hallie's fascination with what the event represents to excavate the meaning of the image of it. So of what ballroom means to Willie and Sam, and how Hallie could possibly use it for his school homework, and how he could describe it in his school homework and understand it through doing the act of completing his school homework. All of this is part of a strategy by Fugard to take an image, that is at first entirely accessible, usually one that creates an empathetic relationship for us. And then he wants us to orbit it and explore it until its meaning is deepened and changed. And that reflects, I think, his process of writing. It's as if the process of writing is about exploring and orbiting the image itself until he can anchor the words to that image. So the idea of a ballroom dancing competition, the idea of a kite, all of these have potentially warm and affectionate emotions attached to them for us as an audience. We then, as an audience, have an immediate kind of affectionate relationship to these symbols and these images. But the way in which the action unfolds and the way in which Fugard loads the storytelling around the image complicates the image for us. The last image that I would like to talk to before moving on to another aspect of Fugard's regional texture is a complicated image of Fugard's relationship to his father. I mean, he uses this image of his father in many of his plays, in particular Master Harold and the Boys, and in Hello and Goodbye. Fugard's father lost his leg in childhood, and it became a recurring problem throughout his life, to the point where eventually Fugard's father got gangrene in the stump of his of the remains of his leg and died from it. And that image of what Fugard's characters, like Hallie, well, to unpack before I mention that, so Fugard, we know from his notebooks, had a really complicated relationship to the stump and his father's leg. It was in his childhood years, it was something that Fugard had to clean and massage and kind of try and help and support and care for his father. He was like a carer to his father, as I'm sure Hallie's mother was to Fugard's father as well. But in using the image, what Fugard does is he gives space for the characters to, like Hallie, to call this image of his father the cripple man. And it's the cripple man not so much about the physical immobility of a person, but rather a cripple man in terms of their mindset, their way of thinking. Fugard has spoken about this in interviews. In talking about this image in Hello and Goodbye, Fugard states this represents the failure of the Afrikaner to escape his own distorted faith, his Calvinist version of history. So just to be clear, this is him describing how he has used the image of his crippled father, what he calls his crippled father, in Hello and Goodbye. I'll repeat it. He says, it represents the failure of the Afrikaner to escape his own distorted faith, his Calvinist version of history. So in a section of his notebooks about Hello and Goodbye, he also adds that even if not seen, the old man's presence must be felt, a bigotry and meanness of spirit as twisted and misshapen as his physical reality. And although he's talking there about Hello and Goodbye, I think that in Master Harold and the Boy, the conception of Hallie's father on the other side of the telephone is that same conception of a man who is twisted and misshapen in his physical reality, as much as he is in his meanness of spirit, and more importantly, in his bigotry. So the crippledness becomes his mental way in the world. He has a crippled mindset, as I said. So this recurring image in his work is then not about the image of a physical disability, but rather of a crippled way in the world, a crippled mindset, as I said. Okay. So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about how he uses language in the piece. And I know we must probably be running short on time, so I'll move through this reasonably quickly. There are many wonderful little regional textures in how he constructs dialogue and phrases. For Hallie, which is the character that's drawn directly from Fugard, he uses words like chum, chaps, old Jan Smuts, old Doc Bromley. These words, chaps, chum, and putting old in front of the name of a man of some kind of authority has two functions in my mind. The one is he's connecting that texture to a colonial history in South Africa. So chum, chaps, and old Doc Bromley all have in some ways a kind of colonial root to a British war history and to South Africa's colonial past, to the British settlers of 1820 who colonized Port Elizabeth and its surrounding areas, to the Boer War and those kinds of relationships. On another level, though, it's also the language that belongs to Halley's school. So this is the language that is prominent in the corridors of his school. So when Halley uses this kind of language with Willie and Sam, we have this nuanced, complex, and very deeply subtextual relationship between Halley as schoolboy being spoken to with this language by his schoolmasters. And then we have Halley then, who arrives at the tea shop and uses this language with Willie and Sam. And the title of the play, Master Harold and the Boys, is obviously deeply connected to this relationship between status, power, master, servant, and how the relationships unfold in that way. So these dynamics of naming are embedded in Fugard's language in a really intricate and textured way. Another word that I find curious in the way in which he uses the word is oscillate. So in the text, he spells oscillate with a K. I might be able to show you here. So I give you a sense of it there. There it is there. Okay. And what I find curious about this is you can see that he uses he replaces the C in oscillate with a K. So the line is, I oscillate between hope and despair for this world as well, Sam. It's Halley's line. I oscillate between hope and despair for this world as well, Sam. So what Fugard is doing here is he's taking the Afrikaans letter K. In Afrikaans, you don't have a letter C. You only have the K sound. And he's putting the Afrikaans K into oscillate as a mishearing from Halley. In doing that, it's another kind of borrowed language. He's connecting Halley's relationship directly to his family environment, where he's got one parent who's of Afrikaans Calvinist heritage and one parent who is of British heritage. And so you've got that kind of language that starts to layer the piece. Another detail, and one that we've tried to draw out in the production, is the way in which Jesus is used both as a name and as blasphemy. So in South Africa, using the name of Jesus as an expression of disbelief or of despair is often done in Afrikaans, even by non-Afrikaans speakers. So it's in common use to say "Yesus" as an expression of casual conversation. So you would say something like, "Yesus, man, I can't believe that." Okay. A choice that we've made in production then is to use the pronunciation of Jesus when used as Jesus Christ, but when Halley uses the word as a slur, he code swaps to the more common South African expression grounded in Afrikaans, Yesus. So these selected examples are just a few of a much more extensive collection of Fugard's use of words. He has a really gifted ability to capture the rhythms, the sounds, and the textures of the place, not only in words, but also in images. So it's all part of an extremely detailed and astute ear of the regional texture of time and place. So, with all of that in mind, how does Fugard take image and language and be so specific about where his plays are set, but become so universal in his message, in his appeal, in his themes? Well, I think the answer, although it's perhaps too big a question to explore in detail now, but in short, the answer is in the relationships. Because when we are dealing with the schoolboy in this play and the two waiters in this play, their relationships are like many things. And yes, the title of the play tells us the two waiters in this play and Halley are like master and servant. And we know that at times, though, their relationship is not like that. At times, their relationship plays out differently. So at certainly at times, Sam and Halley are like father and son. For Willie and Sam, their relationships at times is like older brother and younger brother. I would go so far as to say at times, the relationship of Sam and Willie is like also father and son. At times, the relationship of Sam and Hallie is like teacher and pupil, and that role is constantly inverted and rotated. So it's not always the case that Sam is like a teacher to Hallie. It swaps. And I can go on, because the constant swapping of what their relationship is like gives us a texture that we understand beyond Port Elizabeth. It's the texture of being family, being like brothers, being like a teacher, being like friends, being like best friends, being like enemies, being like master, servant. And it's in all of that constant swapping that we start to get a multifaceted relationship to these images and to these words. The regional texture gives us the authenticity of the world of the play in combination with complex, rich images constructed in complex relationships that we watch develop and change. We immediately recognize this connection of image, word, and clearly drawn relationships as part of our world, no matter where we are, whether we are in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, America, or beyond.